The courtroom fell silent. Then, like a thunderclap, the Supreme Court's judgment echoed across Britain. Keir Starmer's secret plan to quietly bring the UK closer to the EU had just been struck down. And it didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened live on national television, with the whole country watching. It was meant to be a quiet Wednesday morning in Westminster. But as viewers tuned in to what was described as a routine legal review, they got anything but ordinary. Without warning, the highest court in the country delivered a ruling that would shake the political foundation of Britain. The Supreme Court, in a majority decision, declared a series of behind-the-scenes moves, closely tied to Labour leader Keir Starmer, as unconstitutional. But the true shock wasn't just in the ruling itself. It was the fact that it happened. Live, in front of millions of eyes, with the words, "in breach of the sovereignty of Parliament," spoken by the Chief Justice herself. Within seconds, the ruling went viral. Phones buzzed, news alerts exploded, and social media lit up like a firestorm. Clips from the courtroom, Starmer's expression shown split screen as the judgment dropped, began circulating with captions like, "Exposed," "End of the road," and "Brexit betrayal." It didn't take long for the public to react. Some felt vindicated, others betrayed. For those who had always suspected there was more going on behind Labour's public promises, this moment confirmed every fear. And for those who supported closer ties with Europe, it marked a stunning political blow. The ruling came after weeks of pressure from political commentators, Brexit watchdog groups, and even a few brave MPs who questioned a sudden series of regulatory shifts. These shifts, although presented as trade alignment, appeared to fall suspiciously close to EU standards, something many thought Britain had left behind in the Brexit deal. The Supreme Court made clear that these quiet changes were not only made without parliamentary debate, but also masked behind administrative language that misled the public and key members of the government. But what made this such a national moment was not just the content of the ruling, it was its exposure. It was rare for such decisions to be broadcast with such transparency. According to a court official, the public airing was approved due to extraordinary public interest, after reports began to surface linking the regulatory changes to confidential meetings in Brussels. The judges wanted no confusion, no speculation, just cold, clear truth. As the courtroom camera stayed fixed on the bench, the lead justice declared that the attempt to shift Britain's trade rules without democratic debate violated the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. That phrase, repeated across networks' tweets and headlines, cut deep. It didn't just imply overreach, it implied betrayal, and the name that appeared again and again in the documents examined during the case: Keir Starmer. Though not directly, named in the legal charge, internal communications and leaked documents revealed connections to his office. Anonymous sources suggested that Starmer's team had pursued a long-term strategy to realign with the EU by working through secondary legal measures and civil service channels without triggering public scrutiny. The Supreme Court did not weigh on political motivation, but focused strictly on process. Still, the judgment left little doubt about where responsibility pointed. As the live coverage wrapped up, the fallout began almost instantly. Political opponents rushed to call press conferences. Even some Labour backbenchers looked stunned, with whispers of urgent meetings scheduled for the evening. And outside the courtroom, crowds began to gather, some cheering, others shouting in frustration. The country had witnessed something that rarely happens in politics: a secret plan brought to light, not by leaked texts or quiet briefings, but by a clear public legal ruling streamed directly into homes across Britain. Whatever comes next for Keir Starmer, one thing is clear: this moment has changed the game, and the story is just beginning. For months, whispers had been floating through Westminster. Political analysts noticed small, strange policy shifts. Technical regulations quietly updated, import standards slowly adjusted, trade language tweaked to mirror old EU documents. But there was no official statement from Keir Starmer or the Labour Party about returning to the EU or undoing Brexit. On the surface, Starmer maintained the party's position. Brexit was done, and Labour would make it work. Yet behind closed doors, something very different was taking shape. According to court records, leaked communications, and confidential civil service memos, Starmer's office had been involved in a strategic policy maneuver dubbed informally by insiders as the soft realignment path. This plan didn't involve rejoining the EU outright, which would have triggered political uproar and legal battles. Instead, it aimed to slowly bring Britain back into the EU's sphere of influence, without public announcements, and more importantly, without a public vote. The plan reportedly began with a quiet shift in trade policy. Specific goods, like medical, devices, electrical parts, and food products, were gradually brought back under EU-style compliance checks. This was done under the justification of international standards, but the documents revealed these standards were directly pulled from Brussels. Next came adjustments to immigration vetting processes, allowing special entry workers under trade-linked programs that mirrored old freedom of movement clauses. It didn't stop there. Internal emails showed that legal advisors had even drafted a roadmap that would reconnect the UK to certain EU courts and financial institutions under a cooperation framework. None of these moves were illegal in themselves, but they were hidden from Parliament. They bypassed the democratic process, and that's what triggered the Supreme Court case. The argument wasn't about whether Britain should align with the EU. The court didn't rule on policy, it ruled on process. The judges made it clear. Any attempt to reshape Britain's global position must pass through Parliament. Anything less is an insult to the sovereignty of the people. So how did the public discover all this? It started with a whistleblower, an unnamed policy advisor who handed a sealed folder to an independent journalist known for covering Brexit fallout. The folder contained drafts of internal memos marked Confidential, Strategic EU Integration. Within days, a major news outlet confirmed the document's authenticity. Public outrage began to build. While the mainstream press initially downplayed the news, political commentators and online journalists pushed the story forward. Pressure mounted on the court to investigate whether these behind-the-scenes changes were legally sound. That's when the Supreme Court stepped in, fast-tracking the review process under the Public Interest and Constitutional Transparency Clause. This is the clause that allows major national questions, especially ones with democratic consequences, to be reviewed openly. One of the most explosive moments came when a memo from Starmer's foreign affairs advisor was read in court. It said, quote, "Public messaging must remain neutral. We are not to mention the phrase EU realignment under any condition." That line hit headlines across the country. It was no longer just about bureaucracy. It was about trust. When questioned by reporters, Starmer denied any wrongdoing, insisting that all actions were taken in line with current trade needs. But critics weren't convinced. If everything was legal and proper, they asked, why the secrecy? Why the coded language? Why were certain decisions taken through executive orders rather than debated in the House of Commons? The truth is, the plan may have succeeded, if not for the live courtroom decision that brought it all crashing down. Now, many Britons feel their democracy was under silent attack, not by a foreign power, but by their own elected officials. As more evidence surfaces, it's becoming clear this wasn't just a political misstep. It was a carefully managed scheme. Whether Starmer survives the fallout remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The British public will never look at quiet trade regulations the same way again. It was one of the most dramatic legal moments in recent UK history. For the first time in decades, a case involving deep constitutional questions was broadcast live from the Supreme Court. Viewers at home, expecting dry legal talk, were instead pulled into a national shockwave as the justices read out a ruling that would immediately alter the political landscape. The case had been fast-tracked under special provisions due to public urgency and questions of constitutional integrity. These were not words the court used lightly. The justices were aware that their decision would not only affect government policy, but would also speak to the very core of how democracy functions in Britain. As the cameras rolled, the President of the Supreme Court began with a calm, deliberate voice. She laid out the facts. A pattern of executive decisions, made without a vote in Parliament, had reintroduced several EU-aligned laws and frameworks. These changes had not been openly debated. In some cases, ministers were unaware. The public certainly hadn't been informed. One by one, each justice offered their opinion, building a case for why these actions violated the constitutional balance between the government and the elected representatives of the people. The courtroom audience barely moved. Phones were silenced. Even some of the legal teams seemed frozen as the words executive overreach, lack of transparency, and disregard for parliamentary approval echoed through the chamber. But it was the final statement that delivered the knockout blow. This court finds that the actions under review constitute a breach of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and are therefore unlawful. The room fell completely silent. Then came the reaction. In the corridors of Parliament, MPs watched the broadcast in disbelief. Some were seen shaking their heads, others clapped. Back in the media rooms, reporters scrambled to rewrite headlines. On social media, hashtags like Starmer EU Plan, Supreme Strike, and Democracy Wins instantly trended. But the impact wasn't just political, it was personal. Many Britons had grown tired of hearing vague promises from politicians. Brexit had divided families and communities. Now, here was proof, live, undeniable proof, that someone had tried to rewrite the rules from behind the curtain. And the country had watched it all happen in real time. The court made a deliberate choice to allow cameras. According to a later press briefing, the Chief Justice had argued internally that the people had the right to see the democratic system defending itself. In her words, if democracy was being bent, let the correction happen in the light. The justices also addressed a key concern, that the ruling might trigger panic or political chaos. But they were firm. Upholding the Constitution was not a threat to stability, they said. It was the only way to preserve it. In the following hours, more details were released to the press. A full list of the regulatory changes was published. Each one had been flagged for its alignment with pre-Brexit EU policies. Not all were illegal on their own, but together, they painted a picture of intentional design. The court refused to name Keir Starmer directly, noting that political accountability was the responsibility of Parliament and the people. Still, the documents included multiple references to the leader's office and shadow strategy, team. In political terms, this was nothing short of an earthquake. By nightfall, thousands had gathered outside Parliament, some waving Union Jacks, others demanding resignations. Protesters clashed with counter-protesters. One woman on live TV shouted, "This isn't just about Brexit or Starmer. This is about who gets to run this country, us or them." Meanwhile, within the Labour Party itself, chaos spread. Senior figures avoided interviews. Rumors of emergency meetings spread through the political press. Some insiders suggested there were even talks of a leadership challenge if public trust couldn't be quickly restored. The Supreme Court had spoken. It had ruled not against policy, but against process. And in doing so, it had reminded Britain and the world that even in quiet halls of power, the law remains louder than politics. The morning after the Supreme Court ruling, Westminster was on fire, not with flames but with fury, fear, and fallout. Keir Starmer walked into Labour headquarters surrounded by silence. No cameras, no smiles, just tension. The leader who once stood as a figure of calm authority now faced the worst political crisis of his career. Within 24 hours of the ruling, calls for Starmer's resignation began to echo across both mainstream and fringe platforms. Conservative leaders seized the opportunity, accusing him of betraying the nation's trust and secretly plotting to undo the Brexit vote through back channels. Nigel Farage, never one to miss the spotlight, returned to media screens calling for criminal investigations. Even within Labour's own ranks, cracks started to show. At least 4 backbench MPs publicly demanded a full internal review. One MP went so far as to say, "If we keep quiet now, we become complicit." But what does all this truly mean for Britain? First, it's about more than just Keir Starmer. This moment has reignited a national debate over Brexit, democracy, and transparency. Millions who thought the Brexit chapter was closed are now revisiting the question, was it ever really respected? The idea that the UK's political leader could try to realign with the EU through silent legal tweaks has left many questioning how secure their vote actually is. It's not just about policy anymore. It's about power and how it's used behind the scenes. Second, the legal precedent set by the Supreme Court has now drawn a clear red line. No matter who leads, no matter what party wins, any shift in the country's fundamental international alignment must go through Parliament. There will be no more quiet reintegration. If Britain ever chooses to move toward Europe again, or away from it, it must be done in full view of the people. Third, the impact on Labour's chances in the next general election could be devastating. Before the ruling, polls showed Starmer's party leading the Conservatives by 6 to 8 points. Within 2 days of the ruling, that lead vanished. A snap poll revealed a massive loss of trust among older voters, swing voters, and even young first-time voters who had supported Labour, hoping for transparency and progress. "I feel lied to," one university student told a reporter. "I voted for honesty, not secrecy." Meanwhile, in Brussels, the EU issued a short, cautious statement. "We respect the UK's internal legal processes and have no comment on internal Tawa matters." But behind closed doors, sources said EU officials were deeply surprised and frustrated that talks had even occurred without formal notice. One anonymous diplomat stated, "If this was Starmer's quiet return to the table, it has now slammed the door shut again." Protests broke out in major cities, some in support of Starmer, others demanding his resignation. In London, crowds waved signs reading "Defend Democracy," while others chanted, "Out with Starmer." The divide mirrored Brexit-era tensions, once again putting communities at odds. Online, some praised the court's actions as a win for the people, while others warned that the chaos could lead to even more political instability. As for Starmer, he remained mostly silent except for one short televised statement. "I respect the court's decision. I will reflect. But I remain committed to doing what is right for Britain." That was it. No apology, no resignation, just a pause. But the pressure is growing. Opposition leaders are now demanding a parliamentary inquiry. Some Conservative MPs want a vote of no confidence in Labour's leadership. A few legal voices have even suggested exploring if charges could be brought under misuse of power laws. Whether that will happen or not is unclear, but what is clear, politically, morally, and legally, is that Starmer's plan has backfired in the most public and humiliating way. The people now wait. They wait to see whether Keir Starmer will survive, whether Labour will fracture, and whether Britain's relationship with the EU is truly settled. Or if this was just the first chapter of a much bigger story. For now, the ruling stands. The cameras have stopped rolling, but the echoes of that judgment continue to shake the halls of British power.